Introducing America's Workforce Academy, built by Meta. Paid training, a job, and a path to America's future. Because the future is for everyone. Learn more at meta.com/America's Workforce Academy.
Welcome back. In the previous episode, I talked about public value and the limits of ROI as the dominant language of portfolio justification, especially in public sector and institutional environments. The core point there was that efficiency matters, but it cannot be the whole story. Public organizations also exist to uphold accessibility, fairness, continuity, legitimacy, trust, and mission. If portfolio governance forgets that, it may become cleaner on paper while becoming less faithful to the institution's purpose. In this episode, I want to move from the problem of valuing initiatives before approval to something that happens afterwards, and often much less well. I want to talk about benefits, or more precisely, about the strange fact that many organizations are much better at approving projects based on promised benefits than at later asking whether those benefits actually materialized. This is one of the quietest and most important weaknesses in portfolio management. At the front end, organizations often work very hard to justify projects. Business cases are written, benefits are described, efficiency gains are forecast. User improvements are promised, strategic contributions are outlined, risks are noted. The project enters the portfolio partly because it claims value, but once the project has been approved, delivered, and formally closed, something curious often happens. The discipline around value begins to fade. The organization remains very interested in whether the project was delivered. Was it on time, on budget, within scope? Were the milestones completed? Was the rollout successful enough? Did the governance process hold? These questions remain highly visible. But the question that originally helped justify the investment, what value did this actually create, often becomes much less systematically pursued. That is why I call this episode Benefits Nobody Measures. Not because organizations never talk about benefits, but because their attention to benefits is often strongest when benefits are still promises, and weaker when benefits become testable claims. That should strike us as odd. If value is central enough to win approval, it should be central enough to verify. And yet, in many organizations, it is not. There are several reasons for this, and most of them are built into the way governance is structured. The first reason is that delivery is easier to observe than outcome. Delivery has dates, scope items, completion states, milestones, sign-offs, status colors, and formal checkpoints. It fits governance neatly. Outcomes are often slower, messier, more distributed, and harder to attribute. A digital service may be delivered successfully, but whether it changes behavior, improves satisfaction, increases access, reduces burden, strengthens trust, or creates sustainable productivity, gains may only become visible over time and under conditions influenced by many other factors. In other words, delivery is often legible at the moment of governance attention. Benefits are often not. The second reason is organizational ownership. A project team may be responsible for getting something built and implemented, but who is responsible for the value after that? Sometimes it is supposed to be the business owner, sometimes the sponsor, sometimes line management, sometimes operations, sometimes nobody in a truly active sense. Once the project closes, the formal structure that held attention together often dissolves. The work enters operational life, and so does the ambiguity about who should still care enough to measure whether the original case was real. The third reason is emotional. Verifying benefits creates the possibility of disappointment. It may reveal that gains were overstated, adoption was weaker than expected, staff work simply shifted rather than disappeared, old processes persisted, technical burdens increased elsewhere, or strategic promises were more rhetorical than real. Organizations are often much more comfortable with the optimism of projected benefits than with the embarrassment of measured underperformance. That is an uncomfortable point, but an important one. In many cases, weak benefit follow-up is not just a technical gap, it is also a cultural avoidance. The fourth reason is timing. Benefits often do not appear neatly at project closure. They may depend on user adaptation, organizational change, policy adjustment, training, workflow redesign, integration quality, leadership follow-through, or the gradual removal of old ways of working. That means benefit realization can extend far beyond the formal life of the project. If governance is built around temporary initiative windows, then the thing that justified the investment may sit partly outside the period where anyone is structurally required to pay attention. And the fifth reason is that many organizations still confuse outputs with outcomes. System went live, a process was digitized, a dashboard was implemented, a platform was launched, a new feature was delivered. Those are outputs, they matter. But they are not the same as reduced burden, improved access, stronger decision quality, higher trust, lower risk, better continuity, or genuine user value. Yet governance language often slides between these levels more easily than it should. So a project may be called successful because the output arrived, even when the outcome remains weak, partial, or unknown. This is one of the strangest habits in modern governance. We say we care about value, but we often manage more intensely for completion. Now, to be fair, it is not always easy to measure benefits properly. Some benefits are diffuse, some are qualitative, some are long-term, some are partly counterfactual, meaning their value lies in what no longer happens. Some are shared across many parts of the organization. Some emerge only if other changes also occur. So, I am not suggesting that all benefit realization can be reduced to clean measurement. That would be unrealistic. But there is a major difference between difficult to measure and not seriously followed at all. Too many organizations drift from the first to the second. Let us make this concrete with a familiar scenario. Imagine a large digital change initiative in a public organization. The business case promises faster case handling, reduced administrative burden, improved user experience, and more consistent decisions. The project is complex but eventually delivered. The system goes live, training happens, formal closure is achieved. The project is reported as a success in delivery terms, perhaps not perfect but broadly acceptable. Now, 6 months later, what is actually true? Are staff saving time, or are they now spending more effort working around awkward design choices? Has user experience improved, or has confusion simply shifted to another step in the process? Are decisions more consistent, or are people still using side channels and local interpretations? Has administrative burden really fallen, or has work just moved from one team to another? Has trust improved? Has service access improved? Is the promised value real, partial, delayed, or largely symbolic? In many organizations, those questions would not be examined with anything like the seriousness that went into approving the original project. And that is a portfolio problem, not just a project problem. Because portfolios are supposed to be about selecting and balancing investments based on expected value. If expected value is rarely confronted with realized value, then the portfolio does not really learn. It gets better at promising than at understanding. It becomes a system for circulating claims rather than refining judgment. This is where weak benefit follow-up becomes dangerous. It doesn't only affect one project, it affects the quality of future decision-making. If business cases are rarely revisited, then optimism remains cheap. If sponsors are not held to value accountability after delivery, then promises remain structurally under-tested. If learning from weak benefits is not captured, then similar overstatements may keep shaping future approvals. The portfolio becomes vulnerable to what we might call benefit inflation, the quiet tendency to keep promising more than is later verified because the verification culture is weak. This matters a great deal in digital portfolios, where many benefits are easy to describe at a high level: better service, faster handling, more efficiency, better data, better decisions, improved collaboration, enhanced user experience, stronger agility, reduced manual work. These phrases appear constantly in business cases, and sometimes they are entirely justified. But if the organization does not return later and ask what these phrases meant in practice and what actually happened, then they become a genre rather than an evidence base. That is another way of putting the problem. Benefits can become part of the narrative style of approval rather than part of the lived discipline of evaluation. There is also a subtle but important difference between benefit ownership and project ownership. Project ownership is usually defined formally enough to function during delivery. Benefit ownership is often much more fragile. Once the new system is live or the process has changed, someone in line operations may technically own the area. But that does not necessarily mean they have the time, incentive, tools, or mandate to assess the promised benefits against the original case. They may already be absorbed into the next set of demands. The sponsor may have moved on, the PMO may no longer be engaged, the project team may be dissolved, the portfolio board may be focused on upcoming approvals. So benefits enter a kind of institutional afterlife. Everyone assumes they matter, but the formal attention structure around them weakens sharply. This becomes particularly noticeable with organizational change assumptions. Many projects promise efficiency or service improvements that depend not just on the technology working, but on people changing how they behave. Old processes need to be retired. Manual workarounds need to stop. Roles need to shift. Training needs to stick. Managers need to reinforce new routines. Data quality needs to be maintained. If that surrounding change does not occur fully, then the technology may be delivered while the benefit remains partial. But because the project is formally complete, the organization may not return to that gap with much intensity. In other words, the portfolio may count the intervention while losing sight of the transformation. There is another reason benefits are often weakly followed up. Benefits can be politically awkward when they are mixed. Many initiatives produce some value, but not exactly the value promised, or not at the scale promised, or only in some parts of the organization, or only after longer delay, or with hidden trade-offs elsewhere. That is a difficult story to tell in simple governance language. It is easier to declare the project delivered and let the ambiguity disperse into operational life than to hold a serious conversation about which benefits materialized, which did not, and what should be learned from the difference. But again, that comfort comes at a cost. Without serious benefit reflection, the organization loses the chance to improve its own judgment. It also loses the chance to distinguish between different kinds of failure and success. A project may fail to realize benefits because the original case was weak, or because the technology was delivered poorly, or because the organizational adoption was under-supported. or because the context changed, or because benefits were real but of a different kind than initially expected. These are very different lessons, but without post-delivery attention, they blur together into silence. That is why I think benefit realization is not only about accountability, it is also about organizational learning. Right? A portfolio that never returns to its promises becomes shallow over time. It may still look sophisticated. It may still have strategy maps, prioritization models, business cases, and dashboards. But if it does not seriously examine whether promised value became lived value, then its intellectual discipline remains incomplete. This is especially important in public sector and institutional settings. As I argued in the previous episode, many important public values are harder to reduce to narrow ROI. Accessibility, trust, legitimacy, continuity, fairness, compliance, mission support, public confidence. These benefits may be difficult, but that makes follow-up more important, not less. If the organization claims these forms of value as part of its justification, then it should build some way of examining whether they actually improved. Otherwise, public value risks becoming a rhetorical shield rather than a governing commitment. Let me make this concrete with another scenario. Imagine a university implements a major digital service improvement intended to support students more effectively, reduce administrative burden, and improve information quality. The project is delivered. The service goes live. But what happens next? Do students actually find the service clearer? Has equal access improved across different user groups? Are staff saving time or just handling different kinds of problems? Has support demand decreased or merely shifted from one channel to another? Are the benefits being seen only by some users? Is the service now better in one dimension but worse in another? These are not marginal questions. They are the real substance of whether the investment succeeded. And yet, in many environments, such questions would not be pursued with a structured seriousness unless complaints became loud enough to force it. This is why I think one of the most useful distinctions in portfolio management is the difference between value claimed, value delivered, and value realized. Value claimed is what the business case promises. Value delivered is what the project actually puts into place. Value realized is what changes in practice afterwards. Those three are related, but they are not the same. And a mature portfolio needs to keep them separate enough to think clearly. So, what should organizations do differently? First, they should treat benefit follow-up as part of portfolio governance, not as an optional afterthought left to local goodwill. If value justifies approval, then some structured return to value should be expected later. Second, they should define benefit ownership more seriously. Not just who sponsors the project, but who remains accountable for assessing whether promised outcomes emerged after delivery and under what conditions. Third, they should avoid pretending that all benefits can be measured in one clean way. Some will require metrics, some will require user evidence, some will require comparative operational observation, some will require qualitative review. The goal is not perfect measurement, it is responsible examination. Fourth, they should normalize mixed results. Not every project will produce a neat success or failure story. Some benefits will materialize strongly, others weakly. Some may take longer, some may shift form. Governance should be mature enough to hold that complexity without either denial or melodrama. Fifth, portfolios should actively learn from benefit gaps. If business cases consistently overestimate certain types of gain, that should influence future appraisal. If adoption repeatedly proves harder than expected, that should shape future investment logic. If technical delivery succeeds, but organizational uptake keeps lagging, then portfolio leaders need to stop treating that as isolated bad luck and start seeing it as a repeated pattern. And finally, leaders should remember that benefit realization is where stewardship becomes real. Approving a project is easy compared with staying interested long enough to learn whether the promised value actually changed the institution in the way that mattered. There is a broader truth here too. Portfolios do not only reveal what organizations choose to fund, they reveal what organizations are willing to verify. If the answer is mostly delivery and not outcome, then the portfolio is still more comfortable with movement than with truth. That may sound severe, but I think it is fair. Because real strategic maturity is not shown mainly by writing convincing business cases. It is shown by whether the organization can return later, examine what happened, and learn without excessive defensiveness. So let me close with the core argument. Many organizations are much stronger at approving projects based on promised benefits than at following up whether those benefits were actually realized. Delivery is easier to observe than outcome. Output is easier to track than lived change. Ownership often weakens after implementation. And benefit ambiguity can be politically uncomfortable. But without stronger benefit follow-up, portfolios do not really learn. They become good at promising value and weaker at understanding it. A mature portfolio does not stop caring when the project closes. It keeps caring long enough to see whether the value that justified the investment actually appeared in practice. Thank you for listening. In the next episode, I want to close the season by looking forward. What should the portfolio office, or the PMO more broadly, become in a world shaped by AI products, uncertainty, public value, resilience, and more complex forms of governance? In other words, what does the future portfolio office look like if it is not only a reporting and control function, but something more strategically alive? And before we close, let me leave you with one question for your own organization. 6 months after a project in your environment is declared delivered, who is still seriously asking whether the value promised in the original case has actually materialized?
You want to get your backyard summer ready, but you don't want to break the bank? Wayfair gets it. Planning on dining al fresco or relaxing poolside? Wayfair has everything you need to prep your space. Shop now and save up to 70% off during Wayfair's 4th of July clearance. Score huge deals on outdoor furniture, area rugs, and more. We're talking thousands of products for every style and budget. Plus, surprise flash deals July 6th. Don't wait. Shop Wayfair's 4th of July clearance now through July 6th at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.